The plane trembled softly as passengers settled into their seats. First class was meant to be a sanctuary of quiet, luxury-polished leather, golden lights, and whispered conversations. But in just a few minutes, it became something else entirely. Imagine this: a man in a plain gray hoodie, boarding pass in hand, steps towards seat 2A, a seat he paid for, a seat he rightfully owned. But instead of welcome, he meets a wall of flight attendants standing firm, her voice slicing through the cabin. You don't belong here. What happens when calm dignity collides with arrogance in the sky? What happens when a man judged by appearance reveals he holds the power to shake an entire airline to its core? And what lesson do we, as witnesses, carry when the truth is finally forced into the open? This isn't just a story about a seat on a plane. It's about respect, humiliation, and the moment one man decided to stand tall not only for himself, but for all who have ever been told they don't belong. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because what you're about to hear is more than a story. It's a reckoning in the sky. The plane trembled gently, like a giant beast stretching before it took to the skies. The low hum of engines pressed through the cabin walls, mixing with the faint shuffle of footsteps and the muted click of luggage wheels rolling over thick carpet. It was boarding time, and first class already felt like a theater about to open its curtain. The air was calm, yet full of tiny sounds that blended into a single soft rhythm: the ding of an overhead bin closing, the hush of voices greeting one another, the distant echo of an announcement reminding passengers to fasten seatbelts once seated. It was, in many ways, ordinary, too ordinary, almost deceptively so. Among the passengers stepping through the wide doorway was a man who drew no immediate attention. He wore a gray hoodie, faded jeans, and a pair of sneakers that had seen better days. His face was calm, slightly weary, as if he carried the quiet weight of a long week on his shoulders. To many, he looked like someone headed to visit family, maybe even a man who had saved up for a rare luxury, a seat in first class. His name was Jonathan Miles. Jonathan was 45 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with skin the color of rich mahogany and eyes that carried a steady depth. He moved with a calm stride, not hurried, not timid, but with the kind of measured patience that belonged to someone who had learned long ago the value of restraint. Few people on board realized that Jonathan Miles was the CEO of Aeronova Systems, one of the most influential companies in aviation technology. Few knew that only months earlier he had signed a contract worth hundreds of millions with the very airline he was stepping onto, now Sky Continental. And no one, not yet, suspected that within the next hour, this ordinary cabin would transform into a courtroom, a battlefield, and a stage for justice. Jonathan handed his boarding pass to the scanner, the bold letters 2A printed clearly at the top. The gate agent had barely glanced before waving him through, and now, here he was, walking the soft carpet toward the second row of first class, his carry-on slung lightly over one shoulder. Inside, passengers were already settled. A businessman flipped through a financial magazine. A woman adjusted the blanket across her lap while whispering to her child. A pair of college students snapped a quick selfie with the plush leather seats in the background. Jonathan caught none of it. His eyes were steady on the seat that belonged to him. 2A by the window, sunlight spilling in across the armrest. But as he stepped closer, the air shifted. Standing firmly in the aisle, her arms crossed in front of her like a barricade, was the chief flight attendant, Carla Whitman. She was 38, tall, with a sharp chin and eyes that cut as if they could slice through steel. Her uniform was immaculate, her hair pulled tightly back, and her posture radiated authority she seemed eager to display. Her voice was not loud, but it was sharp. Sharp enough to slice through the soft hum of boarding. "You don't belong here, sir." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy as lead. Passengers near the aisle lifted their heads. A businessman in seat 1C lowered his newspaper just enough to watch. A couple in row 3 leaned forward ever so slightly, curiosity brightening their eyes. In an instant, the calm boarding scene had fractured, the silence pierced by a statement that carried both accusation and dismissal. Jonathan stopped just short of Carla's outstretched arm. For a moment, he simply looked at her, his head tilted slightly, as though he had misheard. He did not speak. He did not frown. He simply stood still, the picture of composed patience. Carla's stance did not soften. Her arms tightened across her chest, her chin lifted higher. "First class is for premium passengers only. You'll need to move to the back." Jonathan's gaze flicked downward, to the boarding pass in his hand. The paper was crisp, the black ink bold. His name, Jonathan Miles, and his seat assignment, 2A, stared back at him with quiet certainty. Slowly, deliberately, he raised it and held it forward for her to see. "2A is my seat," he said, his tone calm but unyielding. Carla glanced at the slip of paper, then let out a short, dry laugh. The sound was like the closing of a door, dismissive and final. She shook her head, as if brushing away the words as a nuisance. "Clearly there's been a mistake," she said. "You'll need to move." The businessman in row 1 shifted in his seat. A woman in 2C raised her eyebrows. The whispers began, small ripples spreading across the cabin. Jonathan did not flinch. His chest rose slowly with each breath, his gaze never breaking from the seat that was rightfully his. For years, he had learned to master silence, to let others underestimate him before revealing the truth. Still, a familiar heaviness pressed against his chest. He had lived this moment before different places, different faces, but the same sting of being dismissed, judged, told he did not belong. Inside, a thought flickered. Should I answer? Should I explain? Or should I wait? Let her reveal more of herself before I reveal who I am. The cabin lights glowed warm, but the air felt colder, sharper, filled with the buzz of curiosity and judgment. Carla took a step closer, lowering her voice, but not enough to hide from those nearest. "Men like you don't sit in first class. I've been doing this job for 12 years. I know who belongs here." The word struck harder than a public insult. Jonathan's grip on the boarding pass tightened ever so slightly, his knuckles whitening beneath the paper. But his face remained composed, his eyes steady. He drew in a slow breath and let it go. This was only the beginning, and already curious eyes were watching. Already phones were slipping into hands, screens glowing faintly in the cabin light. Already history was leaning forward, waiting for what Jonathan Miles would do next. Jonathan's breath left his lungs slowly, a measured exhale that steadied his pulse. He had seen faces like Carla Whitman's before the rigid confidence of someone who believed her instincts mattered more than evidence. He did not speak right away. Silence, he knew, was its own kind of power. But Carla mistook his calm for hesitation. Her chin tilted higher, her arms crossing even tighter. "I asked you to move to the back. Sir, you are holding up boarding." Jonathan lifted his boarding pass again, steady as stone. The black print was clear, undeniable. Jonathan Miles, Seat 2O, First Class Premium. He extended it toward her. Carla snatched the slip between her fingers, studied it for barely 2 seconds, then scoffed. "No, This isn't right. I need identification." Whispers rose like wind moving through trees. The businessman in 1C set down his newspaper completely now. His eyes narrowed as he watched. A woman in 2C whispered something sharp to her husband, who shook his head. Curiosity was spreading through the cabin like a ripple in still water. Jonathan reached into his wallet. He paused for a fraction of a second, his fingers brushing against the leather. A memory surfaced, sudden and raw. He was 23 again, fresh out of grad school, walking into a boardroom where he was mistaken for the assistant instead of the engineer who had designed the prototype they were there to discuss. He had smiled back then, held his tongue, and proved them wrong with his work. Now, decades later, the same wound was reopened by different lips. He placed his driver's license in Carla's hand. She lifted it toward the light, tilting it back and forth with exaggerated scrutiny, as though searching for the trick of a magician. Her lips curved into something close to a smirk. "Interesting. But this doesn't convince me. Things can be faked." Jonathan's jaw tightened. His chest ached under the weight of humiliation pressing in on him, but outwardly he remained carved from stone. The cabin's air grew heavy with silence, the kind of silence that demanded a resolution. Then, from the third row, a voice whispered, "I'm going live." Maya Thompson, a 23-year-old law student with a restless energy, raised her phone discreetly. The lens caught the standoff between the calm man in a hoodie and the uniformed gatekeeper barring his way. A red dot blinked. Comments flooded in almost instantly. "What's happening?" One read. "Film everything." Another demanded, "This looks like discrimination." Someone else typed. Jonathan noticed the camera, but did not flinch. He did not fear exposure. In fact, a part of him welcomed the light. The truth, once seen, could not be unseen. Carla pressed forward. "If you want to prove yourself, show me your credit card receipt for this ticket. Otherwise, move." The words rang in Jonathan's ears like a gavel striking a table. Prove yourself, again, always again. A flash of memory came long nights bent over financial models in his early startup days. Sleeping in the office, selling his car to make payroll, sacrificing weekends with his children just to keep Aeronova alive. Every ounce of energy, every drop of sweat, had been spent climbing a mountain so steep most would have fallen. And now, standing at the summit, he was told to prove himself once more. His heart slowed, each beat heavy, deliberate. He could feel anger clawing at his ribs, begging to burst out. But he held it back. Control was the armor that had carried him this far. Passengers leaned in closer, their phones raised. The businessman in 1C muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." The woman in 2C shook her head. Carla's tone sharpened. "Sir, if you do not comply, I will call security." Jonathan met her eyes. His voice was calm, so calm it made the air quiver. "This ticket is mine. This seat is mine. I don't need to prove where I belong." For the first time, Carla's eyes flickered, a shadow of doubt crossing her face, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by defiance. She tightened her grip on the boarding pass and driver's license. Maya's live stream lit up with comments. He showed her proof, and she still refuses. "This is outrageous. Don't back down, sir. We're all watching." Jonathan's mind shifted inward. He thought of his daughter, Lila, who had once asked him why she never saw people who looked like them in the ads for airlines, in the glossy magazines showing smiling first-class passengers sipping champagne. He had answered her gently, promising that the world was changing. that one day dignity would not come with conditions. And here he was, standing in front of a seat he had paid for, feeling her question return to haunt him. Maybe the world had not changed as much as he wanted to believe. The intercom chimed overhead. "Cabin crew, please prepare for departure in 10 minutes. The announcement pressed time down like a steel band, winding the tension tighter. Jonathan straightened his shoulders. His voice dropped low, but carried the weight of command. "You should stop now before you humiliate yourself further." Gas rippled through the cabin. Some passengers smiled faintly, sensing the storm gathering. Others froze, knowing they were standing at the edge of something historic. Carla's nostrils flared. Her pride was her armor, and she wore it too tightly to remove. "I've been doing this job for 12 years. I know who belongs in these seats, and it's not you." Jonathan's face betrayed no anger, only patience stretched thin, like glass about to shatter. Inside, though, his thoughts battled fiercely. Should he end this with one move, one word, one revelation, or should he wait, allow her to bury herself deeper in front of witnesses who could not deny what they saw? The businessman in 1C raised his phone too, whispering to a live audience of his own. "You're watching this. A man with a first-class ticket, being denied his seat. This is happening in real time." The cabin now glowed with dozens of small screens, each one capturing the same moment from a different angle. Dozens of digital eyes stared at Jonathan, waiting for his next move. Jonathan felt their gaze press against him, heavy but not unwelcome. He knew what was at stake. His dignity was not only his own. It carried the weight of everyone who had been told you don't belong in spaces they had worked tirelessly to reach. His fingers brushed against the inside of his jacket pocket, where a sleek leather wallet rested. Inside it lay the truth of who he was, but he held back. Not yet. Instead, he lifted his head, eyes steady as the sea before a storm. "This ticket, this seat, my name in your system, every piece of evidence matches. And yet, you still refuse." Carla smirked. "Anyone can fake an e-ticket. Don't try to play me." The murmurs grew louder. A passenger from economy peeked over the divider. Phone raised high. "We're recording everything," she called. Maya's livestream comments exploded. "She's digging her own grave. Why won't she stop? Fire her already." Jonathan's patience stretched to its edge. He could feel the shift inside him, the slow turning of a tide he had tried to hold back. Soon, he knew, there would be no more waiting. The storm was coming, and when it broke, the entire airline would tremble. The cabin had shifted from quiet anticipation to something more electric. A hum of whispers pulsed from row to row. Passengers leaned into aisles, curious eyes darting between the man in the hoodie and the uniformed attendant standing like a sentry in front of him. Phones glowed in half a dozen hands, their lenses capturing every twitch of expression, every syllable spoken. Jonathan Miles stood rooted, his posture calm, but the storm inside him swelled. His heart moved with deliberate, heavy beats, as though reminding him to keep steady when every instinct demanded release. Carla Whitman's lips pressed tight, her chin lifted high. She still clutched his license and boarding pass in her hands, but her gaze said plainly that no proof would be enough. Her voice dropped, but not enough to be private. "I told you, men like you don't sit in first class. Save yourself the embarrassment. Go to the back before this gets worse." The words struck with invisible force. They were not shouted. They were not crude. Yet they carried centuries of dismissal, an entire history of being told you don't belong. Jonathan felt it ripple through him. A wound reopened in the very place where he had believed he stood as an equal partner. From 3B, Maya Thompson angled her phone higher. She whispered into her mic, her voice tense. "You all heard that, right? This is blatant." He showed his ticket, his ID, and she still won't let him sit. "Share this. Everyone needs to see." On her screen, hearts and comments poured down in a waterfall of outrage. "Oh my God, this is discrimination. Stay strong, man. We're with you." Viewers doubled, then tripled, climbing into the hundreds. Jonathan's eyes closed for half a breath. A memory uncoiled, vivid as if it had happened yesterday. He was 12 years old again, sitting on a cracked porch beside his mother, who held his face between her hands. She had told him, softly but firmly, "One day, people will look at you and try to decide where you belong before you ever open your mouth. But your worth isn't in their eyes. It's in how you carry yourself. Stand tall. Jonathan, always stand tall." The echo of her voice steadied him now. He opened his eyes. Calm once more. Carla misread that calm as defiance. Her brows pinched. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She raised her chin toward the rear of the plane. "Your seat is back there." Jonathan's voice was deep but measured. "My seat is 2A. You are mistaken." She shook her head, lips tightening to a thin line. "Mistakes don't last 12 years. I know who deserves this cabin." Maya's camera caught the sentence perfectly, her live stream commenters exploding in rage. The businessman in 1C muttered, "Ridiculous." The woman in 2C hissed under her breath, "Unbelievable." Jonathan did not raise his voice. He simply repeated, "This is my seat." Carla's nostrils flared. She waved a hand dismissively. "Fine. We'll settle this." She unclipped her radio, pressed the button, and called out, "David, come forward. We've got a seating issue." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the cabin. David Kim, the supervisor, filled the aisle with his broad frame and practiced air of authority. His face, lined with years of routine control, bore the expression of a man used to having the final word. "What's the problem?" he asked, his tone brisk, as though Jonathan's presence was already the inconvenience. Carla gestured sharply at Jonathan. "This man insists on sitting in 2A. His name isn't on the list. I've checked." David extended his hand. "Ticket." Jonathan gave him the boarding pass. David glanced at it, his eyes skimming the bold print seat 2O, first class premium. His lips curled into the faintest frown. He turned his tablet on, swiping quickly. Could be a printing error. Jonathan's voice came calm, even. "It's not an error. My confirmation number is valid. My reservation is here. Check again." David tapped, scrolled, tapped again. His brows twitched, just for a second. Then he saw it. Passenger miles, Jonathan, CEO, Aeronova Systems. He swallowed, but only slightly, and angled the screen away. "Strange. The system shows your name, but—" His voice trailed, his doubt hanging in the air like a fog. Maya's live stream caught the hesitation. Her viewers screamed in comments. "It's in the system. He's right there." How are they still denying him? Jonathan remained still, but inside his thoughts turned restless. He had wanted a quiet flight, a few hours above the clouds to breathe, but the universe had placed him here, once again forced to confront the same storm of judgment. He could end this in seconds with one phone call, one revelation. Yet something in him wanted the world to see, to witness, to understand how easily respect could be stripped when judgment came first. David looked at Carla. "It does show his name." Carla's face flushed, her fists curling. She let out a brittle laugh that snapped through the cabin like a door slamming shut. A CEO dressed like this. Don't insult me. He's pretending. Passengers gasped. Some shook their heads. The businessman in 1C raised his phone higher, whispering, You're seeing this? Right. They're humiliating him, even with proof in front of them. Jonathan's pulse thudded, slow and steady. He stood tall, every inch of his frame carrying the composure his mother had taught him to wear. His words came calm, but heavy as iron. I am Jonathan Miles. This is my seat. And you are making a mistake that will cost you. The cabin hushed again. A ripple of fear crossed David's eyes. Carla, however, pressed harder, her pride refusing to bend. You don't scare me. A real CEO wouldn't be standing here in sneakers, trying to sneak into first class. You're wasting everyone's time. Jonathan breathed in deeply, then out. His eyes turned toward the window seat that should have been his. Sunlight streamed in, golden and warm, a sharp contrast to the cold suspicion pressed against him. Inside his mind, a war raged. Should he reveal himself now? Should he put an end to this with one phone call, one sentence that would collapse their arrogance like sandcastles before a tide? Or should he let them continue, let their words unravel until every witness could no longer deny the truth? He could feel the weight of decision pressing against his chest. The passengers were waiting, their phones ready, their eyes hungry. He knew whatever came next would not just decide his flight. It would decide the story told long after the plane touched ground. Maya whispered into her phone. He's holding back. He's about to do something. Keep watching. The comments flooded in, fiery and relentless. End this. Expose them. We're with you. Jonathan's fingers brushed once more against his wallet inside his jacket. The cool leather grounded him, reminded him of the years he had built his company from nothing, of the signature that now secured a contract worth $920 million with Sky Continental, a signature powerful enough to ground an entire fleet if disrespected. He lowered his hand. Not yet. Instead, he raised his head, eyes locking on Carla's. His voice was low, quiet, but it carried the strength of thunderclouds. The issue isn't who I am. The issue is how you chose to look at me from the first moment, and that will be remembered. The words struck her harder than any shout could have. Her jaw trembled, but pride forced her to hold her ground. The tension thickened, heavier than the pressurized air in the cabin. Passengers leaned forward, breath caught in their throats. Maya's live stream surged into the thousands, each viewer glued to the screen. The storm was no longer distant. It was here, hovering just above the cabin, waiting for the lightning to strike. David Kim's presence in the aisle seemed to darken the air itself. He wasn't loud, but the weight of his authority hung heavy, like a man who had spent years believing his decisions would never be questioned. His broad shoulders squared as he held the tablet in his hands, the glowing screen reflecting against the sharp planes of his face. Jonathan Miles stood steady, still as stone, while David scrolled through passenger data. The supervisor's brow furrowed as his finger dragged down the list. For a brief second, his eyes widened. Jonathan's name had appeared clear as daylight, but David's lips tightened, suppressing the truth. The manifest shows your name, David admitted slowly, his tone uncertain, but there might be a system glitch. Sometimes profiles get misfiled. That could explain why it looks out of place. Jonathan's voice was low, controlled, but it cut through the cabin with precision. Out of place. My name is listed exactly where it should be. Confirmation number, seat, class, everything is correct. The only thing out of place here is your refusal to accept it. The businessman in 1C shifted, his phone angled discreetly toward the confrontation. Passengers across the aisle craned their necks, eyes flicking between Jonathan, David, and Carla as though watching a play unfold on stage. Carla folded her arms, lips curled into a dismissive sneer. I've been doing this job long enough to know when something doesn't add up, and this doesn't add up. You expect us to believe a CEO dresses like that? She gestured at Jonathan's hoodie and sneakers as if they were incriminating evidence. Maya Thompson's phone captured the entire exchange. Her live-stream comments flashed like a storm of fireflies. So what if he's in a hoodie one red? This is profiling, another declared. Hearts streamed across the screen as the number of viewers climbed past 2,000. Jonathan felt the pressure of their stares, both inside the cabin and across the invisible space of the internet. His patience was a thin thread stretched to breaking. His mind flickered to his son, Jordan, who had once asked him at dinner, Dad, do people ever look at you and not believe you're the boss? Jonathan had laughed softly at the time, brushing it off. But deep inside, he knew the truth. The disbelief was constant, and here it was again, on display for strangers and thousands of digital witnesses alike. David tapped at the tablet again. Mr. Miles, the system. It does show your name, but you need to understand. Situations like this require verification. Jonathan's head tilted slightly. His voice sharpened, though it remained calm. Verification? I've shown my boarding pass, my identification. The system confirms my name. What more do you require? A blood test. A few passengers chuckled nervously, their laughter quickly swallowed by the tension. Carla interjected, her tone clipped and final. If you can't provide additional proof, I'm calling airport security. We can't waste more time. We're holding up departure. The intercom chimed as though to punctuate her words. Cabin crew, prepare for departure in 7 minutes. The pressure mounted, squeezing the air from the cabin. Jonathan stood in the center of it all, the eye of a gathering storm. Inside, his thoughts churned. Should he end it now? Should he expose his authority, his power, his undeniable influence with one move? Or should he wait, allow the weight of their arrogance to crush them under its own force before the reveal? He thought of his mother again, her words etched into him like scripture. Dignity is not about how loudly you demand it. It's about how calmly you refuse to let anyone take it. Jonathan breathed deeply, his chest rising and falling with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He glanced at the seat by the window. His seat, 2A still empty, bathed in golden light, so close, yet walled off by prejudice. Maya's whisper threaded through the silence, carried by her phone's microphone to thousands, watching live. He's calm, too calm. He's waiting for the perfect moment. David shifted uneasily, his eyes darting from Jonathan to Carla. He knew the passenger was right, yet loyalty to procedure and to Carla anchored his hesitation. Maybe we should double-check with corporate, he muttered, almost under his breath. Carla snapped her head toward him, her eyes blazing. No, this is my decision. He doesn't belong in 2A. Her defiance rang out clear enough for everyone to hear. Passengers gasped. A man in row 4 whispered loudly, "She's digging her own grave." Jonathan's hand brushed the inside of his jacket again, feeling the cool edges of his wallet. He knew what rested inside his corporate ID, his Centurion card, the tools of validation that could silence every doubt. Yet still he waited, because the deeper Carla and David pressed, the clearer the truth would be for every eye in the cabin and every stranger watching through glowing screens. The businessman in 1C leaned into his phone. "We're live on TikTok right now. This is a CEO being humiliated by his own airline partners. This is going to explode online." Jonathan's voice rang out steady, deliberate. "You're standing in front of proof and still refusing to see. This is no longer about my ticket. It's about your judgment." Carla rolled her eyes. "Save your speeches. Either show me your credit card receipt or step aside." The murmur of passengers grew louder, frustration and disbelief mixing in the confined air. "Why won't they stop?" someone muttered. "He's proven it already." Another whispered, "This is beyond embarrassing." Jonathan's patience was splintering. His heartbeat steadied into something almost meditative, the stillness of a man preparing to wield power that could shatter illusions. His gaze met Carla's, unblinking, unwavering. "You are about to make a mistake so public that the world will remember your name for all the wrong reasons," he said quietly. The words struck the air like the first low rumble of thunder before a storm. Carla opened her mouth to retort, but before she could speak, Maya's livestream viewer count ticked higher 3,000, then 4. Comments flooded in, demanding action, demanding justice. The walls of first class no longer contained the moment. It was spilling outward, into the world beyond the plane, into the digital sphere where truth could not be hidden, where judgment would be made by thousands, then millions. Jonathan straightened his shoulders. He knew what came next. The time for patience was nearly gone, and the storm was ready to break. The hum of the engines outside was steady, but inside the cabin the atmosphere had curdled into something brittle, ready to snap. The air smelled faintly of leather and reheated coffee, yet beneath it lingered the sharp scent of tension, the unspoken unease of dozens of passengers caught in the gravity of one confrontation. Jonathan Miles had not moved from the aisle beside his seat. He stood rooted, calm in his posture. Yet the patience in his chest was thinning into threads. Carla Whitman still blocked the way with her rigid stance, her eyes burning with the conviction of someone who refused to be wrong. David Kim lingered beside her, the supervisor's authority faltering under the weight of truth he tried to ignore. Maya Thompson's phone streamed silently, her audience climbing by the hundreds each minute. On her screen, the chat exploded in outrage. "He's right there in the system. This is humiliating. Don't let them push you out." The hearts flickered upward like sparks from a growing fire. Jonathan let his gaze sweep across the cabin. Faces stared back at him, some wide-eyed with shock, others with pity, some with anger that wasn't even theirs but borrowed from the injustice they were forced to witness. His chest ached with the familiar wound of being judged before being known. Yet beneath it, a steel resolve gleamed brighter. Carla's voice snapped the silence. "Enough. You've wasted enough of our time. I'm calling security right now." She raised her radio, her finger hovering above the button. Her lips were tight, trembling slightly, though she masked it with defiance. Jonathan's voice rang out, calm but resonant, cutting through the thick air like a clean blade. "Before you do that, perhaps you should call a different number. Call the executive office of your airline. Ask them about the contract bearing my signature." A collective gasp rippled through the passengers. David blinked, his head snapping toward Jonathan with uncertainty clouding his eyes. Carla froze mid-motion, her finger hovering. Maya whispered into her phone mic, "Did you hear that he said contract? He's someone big. Oh my God, keep watching." Her viewers surged past 5,000. Carla forced a laugh, brittle and cracking at the edges. Don't bluff. No man in sneakers holds a contract with this company. Jonathan's eyes gleamed, cool as tempered steel. Sneakers don't sign contracts. People do. And my name has been etched on yours for nearly $1 billion worth of maintenance. The words detonated in the cabin like a suppressed explosion finally unleashed. The businessman in 1C muttered into a phone camera, "This is it. This is the reveal." Passengers gasped, whispered. Some even clapped in disbelief. A teenage boy from economy leaned over the divider with his phone raised, his voice carrying, "We're recording everything. The whole world's gonna see this." Jonathan reached into his jacket slowly. The cabin hushed, every eye pinned to the deliberate motion. He pulled free a sleek leather wallet, placing it calmly on the armrest of seat 2A. With steady hands he opened it and withdrew a black card so rare its matte surface seemed to swallow the light around it. The Centurion card. Gaffs erupted like sparks across the cabin. Phones tilted forward, lenses zooming in. A murmur rolled through the rows. Jonathan set the card on the tray table, then drew out another item. A slim identification case, dark leather. The logo of Aeronova Systems stamped in silver. Inside, a badge glimmered. Jonathan Miles, Chief Executive Officer. The evidence lay before them, silent and unassailable. Carla's color drained. Her mouth opened, but no words came. David's shoulders stiffened as if locked in place. Maya's voice shook as she whispered into her phone. "You're watching history." He just laid it all out. This is the CEO. This is real. Her viewer count surged to 7,000, then 8. Jonathan leaned back slightly, his posture composed, his voice low yet resonant. "You wanted proof. There it is. But the truth isn't about the card or the badge. The truth is how you chose to treat me before you ever knew my name." The words landed heavy, undeniable. Carla's lips trembled. Her pride screamed for another defense. Yet her voice betrayed her, thin and weak. No. These can be faked. I've seen scams before." Passengers erupted with murmurs. "She's still denying it. How blind can you be? This is career suicide." Jonathan's gaze hardened, though his tone remained calm. "You can deny me all you want, but you cannot deny the thousands already watching this unfold. Every word you speak is recorded. Every second you refuse the truth adds to the humiliation of this airline." David shifted uneasily, sweat dotting his forehead. His authority was slipping, shredded by the clarity of what stood before him. Perhaps we should confirm with corporate," he stammered. Carla's head whipped toward him, her eyes desperate. "Don't you see? This isn't real. It can't be." No CEO would. Her words faltered as Jonathan pulled out his phone and placed it on the tray table. The screen glowed bright, displaying a contact name in bold letters. Evelyn Carter, Director of Corporate Relations, Sky Continental Airlines. Jonathan did not press call. He simply let the glow sit there, shining like a warning beacon. His voice was soft, each word deliberate. With one touch, this entire airline trembles. The silence was thunderous. Carla's breathing quickened, her grip on the radio trembling. David swallowed, unable to mask the fear rippling across his face. Maya's audience shot past 10,000. Comments cascaded. "This is insane. She's finished. History in the making." Jonathan's eyes swept the cabin, his presence radiating authority impossible to dismiss. "The question now isn't whether I belong in this seat. The question is whether your airline deserves my signature on its future contracts." Gasps, murmurs. Even applause broke out. Some passengers clapped softly. Others shouted, "Respect him. This is justice." Carla stumbled back half a step, her radio lowering, her pride fracturing like glass under too much pressure. She muttered, barely audible, I was only doing my job." Jonathan's gaze pinned her in place. Your job is to treat every passenger with respect, not to decide who is worthy. The line struck her like a verdict. Tears welled in her eyes, but she clenched her jaw, refusing to bow. The intercom crackled, the captain's voice filling the cabin. "First class, report the situation immediately. We are past scheduled departure." His tone was clipped, impatient, unaware that his crew's arrogance had already delayed more than a flight. David glanced between Carla and Jonathan, his face pale. "Mr. Miles, please, give us a moment." Jonathan folded his arms, his voice calm but firm. "As you've had every moment, and you squandered them." The cabin trembled with the weight of it all. In that suspended silence, the storm had broken. The truth lay bare, and the world was watching. The intercom's static faded, but the weight of the captain's voice lingered. Every passenger in first class sat taut as wire, waiting. Even those who had tried to distract themselves with magazines or earbuds had abandoned the pretense. All eyes were fixed on the narrow space where Jonathan Miles stood, his evidence laid bare on the tray table, and where Carla Whitman and David Kim shifted uneasily under the growing storm. Carla's knuckles were pale around the radio. Her pride screamed at her to push forward, but her body trembled as if fighting itself. David wiped a bead of sweat from his temple, glancing between the passenger with the unshakable composure and the chief attendant whose authority was slipping like sand through her fingers. Jonathan remained calm, his voice low but edged with steel. "Call the captain. Call headquarters. Call whomever you want. But every second you hesitate only proves this isn't about protocol. It's about prejudice." The businessman in 1C muttered audibly now, no longer whispering, "He's right. Everyone can see it." Others murmured their agreement, their voices blending with the low hum of the engines outside. Maya Thompson's phone glowed brighter in the dim cabin light. Her live-stream viewer count surged to 12,000. The chat was a blur of outrage and disbelief. She whispered into the mic, "They can't deny him any longer. Not with everything in front of us." Carla shook her head as though trying to dispel a nightmare. I don't believe this. It doesn't make sense. CEOs don't travel like this. Not in hoodies. Not quietly." Jonathan's eyes narrowed, his voice calm but devastating. "That sentence will outlive your career." The silence after his words was suffocating. Carla faltered, her lips trembling, but pride locked her jaw shut. Then came the sound of polished shoes striking the carpeted aisle. Firm, decisive steps. Captain Raymond Cole appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, his pilot's stripes gleaming under the overhead lights. His expression was carved from stone, but his eyes carried the urgency of a man dragged into a storm not of his making. "What's going on here?" His baritone filled the cabin. The authority of command resonated in every syllable. David straightened, grasping at formality. "Captain, this passenger refuses to move from a seat that doesn't belong to him." Jonathan's head tilted slightly, calm as ever. "Correction. This is my seat. Every document proves it." Carla thrust the boarding pass forward as though presenting evidence in court. "He claims seat 2A. I've worked 12 years, and I can tell when something doesn't add up." "This doesn't add up." The captain took the slip, scanning it under the dim light. His eyes flicked to Jonathan, then back to the boarding pass. He pulled a small device from his pocket and keyed in a code. The manifest appeared in seconds. Passenger Miles. Jonathan. Seat 2A. Status cleared. A frown crossed the captain's face. He looked directly at Jonathan. Mr. Miles. Yes, Jonathan replied evenly. You are listed. Your reservation is valid. Your seat is 2A. The captain's voice was flat, authoritative, undeniable. Gasps broke from passengers. Someone clapped once, sharply, before stopping. Murmurs rose. Maya whispered into her phone. The captain confirmed it. You all heard that. This is undeniable now. Her audience soared past 15,000. Comments poured in like a flood. Captain confirmed. She's done for. Just as Jonathan stood steady, his arms folded across his chest. Yet inside, a war still raged. A part of him wanted to let it end here. The captain's word was enough, but another part, the deeper part, knew this was no longer about whether he got his seat. This was about exposing the quiet rot of assumptions that had chained him at the door of dignity for his entire life. Carla's face flushed red, her eyes widening in disbelief. No, this can't be. A CEO doesn't. He doesn't look like this. He doesn't act like this. Her voice cracked under the weight of her own denial. Jonathan's gaze sharpened. You've just defined prejudice in front of witnesses and thousands more watching. Even with your captain confirming the truth, you cannot accept it because it doesn't fit your picture of power. The words struck harder than any raised voice could. The captain shifted, his jaw tight. He turned to Carla. That's enough. Step aside. But Carla's pride had crossed the point of no return. Her voice rose, desperate and defiant. I know what I see. He's lying. He's pretending. Anyone can fake a record. Anyone can. Her tirade was cut short by Jonathan's voice, low but commanding, vibrating with restrained thunder. Enough. The cabin froze. Even the air seemed to pause, waiting. Jonathan lifted his phone, the contact for Evelyn Carter still glowing on the screen. With one tap, the line rang. Speaker engaged for all to hear. The second ring. The third. Then a voice came through. Crisp, unmistakable. Jonathan, I heard there's an incident. What's happening? The cabin gasped. The passengers stared at the phone like it was a mirror showing them a new reality. Jonathan's voice was steady. Evelyn, I am standing in front of seat 2A with my boarding pass, identification, and manifest confirmation, yet your staff insists I don't belong here. Silence followed. Then Evelyn's tone hardened. That is absurd. You are one of our highest-level partners. Mr. Miles, I deeply apologize. Put me on speaker so everyone can hear me clearly. Her voice thundered into the cabin. Attention, crew. This man is not just a passenger. He is Jonathan Miles, CEO of Aero Nova Systems. He is the very person whose signature secures your fleet's safety under a $920 million contract. Treat him with the respect he is owed immediately. The reaction was electric. Gasps. Applause. Some passengers cheered, others whistled, phones shot higher, catching every second. Maya's livestream count rocketed past 20,000. Her hands shook as she whispered, You're witnessing history. He just ended them. Carla staggered back, her radio slipping from her grip. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Tears welled in her eyes as the enormity of her actions crashed down. David's face turned ashen, his authority dissolved. Jonathan slid the phone back into his pocket. His gaze swept the cabin, calm yet commanding. Sometimes the truth needs only one voice to expose it. Today, that voice came from the top, but it should never have been needed in the first place. Applause grew, spreading down the aisle like a wave. Passengers clapped not just for his status, but for the quiet strength with which he had carried himself through humiliation into vindication. The captain's voice was quieter now, filled with respect. "Mr. Miles, please, take your seat. We'll resolve the matter immediately." Jonathan stepped forward at last, sliding into the leather of seat 2A. The sunlight caught his face through the window, painting him in gold as if the cabin itself had chosen its verdict. But even seated, he radiated authority. His arms folded across his chest, his gaze steady. The storm had not ended. It had only shifted, because now the question was no longer whether he belonged. It was whether the airline could survive the truth revealed in this cabin. The applause ebbed into a low hum of voices, each passenger still buzzing from the revelation. Jonathan Miles sat in 2A now, his posture firm, his face calm, but the atmosphere had not settled. It had only shifted into a sharper edge. The tension was no longer about whether he belonged. It was about what would happen next. Carla Whitman had shrunk against the sidewall of the cabin, her uniform suddenly looking like a costume she no longer deserved to wear. Her eyes were red, her lips trembling, but her pride clung like a drowning hand to driftwood. David Kim lingered in the aisle, his shoulders stiff, his authority reduced to the nervous fidget of his fingers against his tablet. Captain Raymond Cole remained near the front, his presence both reassuring and strained. He had seen delays, diversions, even emergencies in his decades of flying, but never had the air in his cabin felt like a courtroom, where every breath was evidence, every silence a verdict. Jonathan placed his phone flat on the tray table, its black screen a reminder of the voice that had just thundered through the cabin. Evelyn Carter's words still echoed in the minds of passengers, undeniable proof of who he was. Yet Jonathan knew one call was not enough. He had endured humiliation in front of strangers and tens of thousands of viewers online. That wound needed more than apology. It demanded change. His voice carried across the cabin, steady and deliberate. "The issue is no longer my seat. The issue is how your airline treats its passengers, how judgment was made before proof was even considered. That must change, or your company will pay a price far greater than a delay." Gasps spread. Passengers turned to one another, whispering rapidly. Some nodded in fierce agreement. Others simply watched, spellbound, aware that they were witnessing a reckoning larger than themselves. Maya Thompson's phone shook slightly in her hand as her live stream soared to 25,000 viewers. Her whisper trembled with excitement. "He's not done. He's making demands now. This is bigger than just a seat." Carla's head jerked up, her pride reigniting for one last spark. "You can't talk like that. You don't make the rules here." Jonathan's eyes cut toward her, calm but devastating. "I signed the contract that keeps your planes in the sky. Do you really believe I don't make the rules?" The silence that followed was crushing. Passengers gasped again, some audibly muttering their agreement. "He's right. She doesn't understand who she's dealing with. This is unbelievable." David finally spoke, his voice strained. "Mr. Miles, please, let us handle this. We will apologize formally." Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his gaze unyielding. "Apologies are worthless without change. Here is what I require." His voice was no louder than before, yet it rolled across the cabin with the gravity of thunder. Every frontline employee retrained, a new protocol that ensures no passenger is judged by appearance alone, and a public statement acknowledging this failure within 24 hours. Carla's lips parted, shock freezing her in place. David paled, his throat tightening. Even the captain seemed taken aback by the blunt clarity of Jonathan's demands. Passengers leaned in closer, phones raised higher. Someone in row 4 whispered loudly, "This is history. He's rewriting airline policy mid-flight." Maya's chat exploded. "Yes, make them change justice." "In real time," David stammered. "Such decisions must go through the board." Jonathan's tone sharpened, though it remained composed. "Then call the board. Or better yet, call your CEO. But hear me clearly if these demands are not met. The $920 million contract with Aeronova Systems will be terminated, effective immediately." The words struck like lightning. Gas filled the cabin. A woman in 2C clapped her hand over her mouth. The businessman in 1C muttered into his phone, "He just threatened to pull the contract. That's the whole fleet. This could destroy them." Carla staggered, her pride dissolving into visible panic. No, you can't. That would." She trailed off, her voice cracking into sobs. Jonathan's eyes stayed fixed, calm as a still ocean. "I can, and I will, unless change begins now." The captain exhaled heavily, his shoulders weighed down by the reality of what had just been laid in his cabin. He knew the company's survival hung on this moment. He reached for the intercom, his voice low but steady. "Station manager, report to the aircraft immediately. We need corporate intervention before departure." The cabin buzzed with nervous energy. Passengers whispered in disbelief. Phones streamed every word. Maya's audience ticked past 30,000, comments pouring in faster than her eyes could follow. Jonathan leaned back in his seat, arms folded across his chest. His voice lowered, but carried still, clear as ever. "The choice is yours. Either change or collapse." The ultimatum hung in the air like a verdict awaiting execution. The cabin had become a tribunal in the sky, and Jonathan Miles was both witness and judge. Outside, the engines thrummed with steady patience, as though even the plane itself waited to know whether it would rise today under the shadow of truth. And inside, every passenger knew they would carry this story long beyond the runway. Because this was no longer a flight. It was a turning point, carved into memory, broadcast to the world, and impossible to forget. The hum of voices in first class had shifted from disbelief to raw anticipation. It was no longer just a delay, no longer just a conflict over a seat. It had become something far larger, something that felt destined to be remembered. Every phone held aloft shimmered like a beacon, recording history from a dozen different angles. Jonathan Miles sat in 2A, his posture calm, his expression steady, but the words of his ultimatum still hung in the cabin like heavy smoke. He had given them a choice: change or collapse. Carla Whitman sat slumped against the wall, her face streaked with silent tears, her pride crumbling. David Kim stood beside her, pale and stiff, his hand gripping his tablet like a shield he no longer knew how to use. Captain Raymond Cole remained by the cockpit door, his gaze hardened, already aware that this had moved beyond his authority. The cabin doors hissed open. Firm footsteps echoed on the carpet. A man in a tailored gray suit strode down the aisle, his silver name badge catching the cabin lights. Thomas Grant, station manager of Sky Continental Airlines, carried himself with the brisk authority of someone used to fixing problems before they became disasters. Yet as his eyes swept the scene, he knew instantly this was already far beyond a routine crisis. Passengers whispered his title aloud. Some pointed. Phones tilted toward him, catching his every movement. Maya Thompson's livestream viewers spiked past 35,000. Her voice trembled with excitement. The station manager just came on board. This is escalating fast. Thomas stopped just short of Jonathan's seat. His voice was firm but measured. Mr. Miles, I am Thomas Grant, station manager. I've been briefed on part of the situation. Jonathan lifted his eyes, calm but sharp. Then you already know enough. The question is whether your airline intends to face the truth or bury it. A ripple passed through the cabin. Passengers leaned forward, eyes locked on the confrontation. Thomas adjusted his tie, a bead of sweat glistening at his temple. We take these incidents very seriously. I want to extend an apology on behalf of the airline. I can assure you that this will be reviewed internally. Jonathan cut him off with a voice steady as stone. Not good enough. You heard my terms. Retraining, a new protocol, a public statement within 24 hours, and a clear acknowledgement that what happened here was unacceptable. The station manager hesitated, his face tightening. Mr. Miles, demands like that, they require board approval. Jonathan leaned back slightly, his arms folding, his voice lowered, each word precise, deliberate. Then call the board, call your CEO, call whomever you need. Because if these terms are not met, the $920 million contract with Aeronova Systems is terminated tonight. Gasps erupted. Some passengers clapped again, others whispered furiously. The businessman in 1C muttered into his phone. You heard that. He's holding them by the throat. Maya's stream count climbed higher. Over 40,000 now. Her chat scrolled faster than she could follow. Justice, power, respect, change now. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his authority unraveling under the weight of the cameras, the witnesses, and Jonathan's unshakable presence. Mr. Miles, please, let's discuss this privately. Jonathan's eyes glinted cold. No, this happened publicly. It will be addressed publicly. Every passenger here was forced to witness my humiliation. Every passenger here deserves to witness your accountability. A wave of applause broke through. Passengers shouted, Yes, that's right. No more hiding. Thomas's jaw tightened. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, dialing with trembling fingers. A hush fell over the cabin as everyone leaned closer. The faint ringing carried through the air. Then, a click. Patricia Hayes. A clear, authoritative voice answered. The passengers stirred. Even those in economy strained to hear through the divide. Thomas swallowed. Madam CEO, I have Mr. Jonathan Miles here on Flight 772. There has been an incident. On speaker. Patricia Hayes' voice was crisp, tinged with urgency. I've already been briefed by Evelyn Carter. Put me on speaker, now. Thomas obeyed, his hand shaking slightly as he held the phone high. Patricia's voice filled the cabin, commanding and firm. Mr. Miles, I am Patricia Hayes, CEO of Sky Continental Airlines. First, let me say how deeply sorry I am for what you've endured. What you experienced is indefensible. Gas rippled through the cabin again. Phones tilted closer. Jonathan's voice was calm but edged with steel. An apology is a beginning, Patricia, but apologies mean nothing without action. You've heard my terms. There was silence on the line for a long, heavy moment. Then Patricia's voice returned. Slower, heavier. I accept your terms. We will retrain every frontline employee. We will establish new anti-bias protocols. And tomorrow morning, I will personally hold a press conference to acknowledge this failure and commit to change. The cabin erupted, Passengers clapped, some cheering openly, others shouting their approval. Phones captured every second. Maya's live stream count ticked past 50,000. Her voice cracked with emotion. "You're watching this live. The CEO herself just surrendered to his terms. This is change in real time." Carla let out a broken sob, collapsing into a nearby seat. David lowered his head, shame burning across his face. Thomas Grant remained frozen, his authority stripped, reduced to the vessel carrying his CEO's reluctant concession. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice carrying calm authority. "Good. Then let the world hear it tomorrow. And let every passenger here know that their dignity is not optional. It is a right." Applause thundered through the cabin. Some passengers stood, clapping fiercely. Others shouted Jonathan's name. The atmosphere was no longer heavy with humiliation, but charged with the energy of triumph, of justice long denied, but finally spoken aloud. Patricia's voice came through once more, quieter but resolute. "Mr. Miles, on behalf of the company, thank you for forcing us to confront this. We will not forget it." Jonathan's gaze swept the cabin, calm yet unyielding. "Make sure you don't, because if you do, I'll remind you." He ended the call. The silence that followed was filled not with fear, but with awe. The passengers looked at him not as a man in a hoodie, but as a leader who had turned a seat into a tribunal and a flight into history. And still, Jonathan's face betrayed no gloating smile, no outward victory, only the quiet steel of a man who knew the battle was bigger than himself. The engines outside roared softly, readying for departure at last. But for everyone on board, they knew the flight was already unforgettable. The cabin was no longer the same place it had been when boarding began. The leather seats, the soft golden lights, the carefully curated silence of first-class all of it had been transformed. What was once a stage for quiet luxury had become a public courtroom in the sky. And now, with the airline CEO conceding live on speakerphone, the tribunal's verdict was clear. Jonathan Miles sat in 2A, arms folded, his face still composed, but inside his chest, emotions churned like opposing currents. Relief pressed against anger, pride balanced uneasily against weariness. He had stood firm. He had forced the truth into the open, but the scars of humiliation did not disappear simply because others finally saw them. Carla Whitman remained slumped in a passenger seat at the side of the cabin. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale. Tears streaked her cheeks, and her lips moved as though she were still trying to form excuses. But no words emerged. The pride that had once burned so fiercely now looked like ashes clinging to a dying flame. David Kim stood stiffly beside her, his tablet clutched loosely in one hand. His head was bowed, his shoulders sagging. The man who had once walked the aisles with the false certainty of authority now looked like a child who had wandered into a storm too great for him to weather. Passengers filled the silence with their own voices. Applause still burst intermittently, some clapping until their palms were red, others muttering words of encouragement toward Jonathan. A woman leaned over from 2C and whispered, "You did more than win your seat. You won for all of us." Jonathan turned slightly, offering her a quiet nod. He did not smile, but his eyes carried a flicker of gratitude. From the third row, Maya Thompson still held her phone high. Her live stream counter ticked past 60,000. The chat was a blur of hearts and exclamations, viewers flooding the feed with words like respect, justice, dignity. She whispered into the mic, her voice trembling. "For everyone just joining, The airline CEO accepted his terms. This man, Jonathan Miles, just changed history, mid-flight. Her eyes flicked toward Jonathan, and for a moment she caught his gaze. Something in his look reminded her not of triumph, but of quiet responsibility. She realized then that he wasn't doing this for spectacle. He hadn't raised his voice once, hadn't brandished anger like a weapon. He had simply stood firm, calm, resolute, and the world had bent around his resolve. The intercom crackled again. Captain Raymond Cole's voice breaking through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize once more for the delay. We have been cleared for departure. Please take your seats." But the captain's voice no longer carried the crisp authority of routine commands. It carried something else, deference, caution, even respect. He knew that what had just unfolded in his cabin would ripple far beyond the runway. Jonathan adjusted his seatbelt slowly, his movements deliberate. Around him, the passengers began to settle, yet the air still crackled with the energy of everything that had just transpired. As the engines roared louder, Carla finally lifted her head. Her voice was hoarse, trembling, but audible. "I was just doing my job," she whispered, though no one had asked. Several passengers turned toward her, shaking their heads. One man muttered, "That wasn't your job. That was your prejudice." A woman nearby added sharply, 12 years of experience, and you still couldn't see past his clothes." Carla flinched as if struck, her eyes welling again. She pressed her hands to her face, muffling a sob. Jonathan studied her for a long moment. His chest tightened with conflicting emotions. He wanted to condemn her, to let her drown in the consequences of her arrogance. But another part of him, the part forged by years of being doubted and dismissed, recognized something else in her collapse. Fear, ignorance, the hollow regret of someone who had finally realized too late that she was the villain in her own story. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm, measured. "Carla." Her hands dropped slowly. Her red, swollen eyes flicked to his. "Your job was never to decide who deserves respect. Your job was to give it freely, not just to me, but to every person who walks onto this plane. Remember that, if you want to carry anything out of this moment." Her lips quivered. She nodded faintly, though tears still streaked down her cheeks. Passengers murmured. Some looked at Jonathan with awe, others with deep respect. One man whispered, "He didn't just win, he taught her." Maya's viewers filled the chat with messages powerful. Grace, dignity in action. Her counter climbed again. 70,000 now. The engines thundered, the plane beginning to taxi. The cabin shook gently as the aircraft rolled toward the runway. But inside, no one was thinking of destinations or connections anymore. They were thinking of what they had just witnessed. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, leaning his head back. His mind replayed the confrontation in fragments, the dismissive laugh, the demand for receipts, the refusal to believe his name even when it glowed in their system. Each memory landed like a bruise inside him. For a brief moment, doubt flickered through him. Was it worth it? To expose so much of himself? To let the entire cabin, the entire world, peer into his humiliation just to force change? His chest ached with the weight of the answer he wasn't sure he wanted to give. But then he remembered the faces of the passengers. The woman in 2C whispering her thanks. The teenager in economy shouting into his phone that he was recording everything. The thousands of hearts flickering upward in Maya's live stream. And he realized that what had happened was no longer his alone. His humiliation had been shared, but so too had his strength. The plane lifted from the runway, pressing passengers back into their seats. The ground fell away, and with it, Jonathan felt a sliver of the weight leave his chest. He turned his head slightly, gazing out the window. Clouds drifted below, white and endless. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. Not the image of a man in a hoodie, not the CEO with a Centurion card, but a man who had stood against arrogance and refused to yield. Beside him, the businessman in 1C leaned closer. "Mr. Miles," he said softly, "whatever happens to this airline, you should know you've changed how we see things, at least for me." Jonathan nodded faintly, his voice quiet but steady. "That's all I wanted, for people to see." The man smiled, shaking his head in quiet admiration. As the aircraft climbed higher, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting everyone in softer hues. The storm of confrontation had passed, but the echoes of it lingered, heavy with meaning. Carla sat silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. David remained frozen, his face pale, his tablet forgotten. Captain Cole stayed in the cockpit, his voice absent from the intercom now, perhaps wrestling with what he too had witnessed. And Jonathan, seated in 2A, carried the quiet burden of victory. It was not a triumph born of celebration. It was a triumph born of necessity, one that carried with it the heavy reminder that dignity should never have been up for debate in the first place. For the passengers, for the viewers, for the airline itself, this flight would forever be remembered as more than a journey between two cities. It would be remembered as the day prejudice was confronted, dignity was defended, and justice spoke loudly without ever needing to shout. And as the plane pierced through the clouds, Jonathan Miles closed his eyes again, not to rest, but to carry forward the resolve that had carried him here. The resolve to never let silence be mistaken for weakness, and to remind the world again and again, if necessary, that respect is not a privilege, but a right. The steady hum of the engines filled the silence as the plane leveled off at cruising altitude. Outside, the world was a canvas of clouds, endless and serene. But inside first class, the air still throbbed with the echoes of what had just unfolded. The confrontation had ended, yet no one felt it was truly over. It was only transforming, shifting from a live spectacle in one cabin to a story racing across the world at light speed. Jonathan Miles sat still in seat 2A, his posture as calm as it had been since the beginning. But his phone buzzed relentlessly on the tray table. Notifications flared across the screen texts, emails, alerts from news outlets that had already picked up the live stream. Words like breaking, discrimination, CEO, viral scrolled past faster than his eyes could follow. Across the aisle, Maya Thompson tried to steady her hands as she continued her live stream. Her viewer count had climbed past 80,000. The comments scrolling in an unstoppable cascade. History in real time. Respect is not negotiable. I'll never fly this airline again unless they change. Maya's voice trembled as she whispered to her audience, "You're watching this as it happens. The world knows now. It's not just this cabin anymore." Passengers murmured around her, some scrolling on their own phones, showing each other the headlines that were already forming. Sky Continental confrontation, black CEO humiliated in first class. Airline CEO forced to apologize mid-flight. Carla Whitman sat slumped, staring blankly at the floor, her face pale and tear-streaked. The earlier fire of her defiance had turned to ash. She looked smaller now, diminished, as though the weight of the cameras and the world's judgment pressed down on her shoulders. David Kim remained beside her, silent and hollow, his authority drained. Jonathan glanced at his buzzing phone. then silenced it with one deliberate press. He didn't need to see the headlines to know the storm was already raging. He had felt storms like this before, only this one was louder, faster, carried not in whispers behind closed doors, but in live streams reaching millions. The businessman in 1C leaned toward him, lowering his voice. "Mr. Miles, you realize what you've just done by tomorrow morning? The whole world will be talking about this." Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his eyes calm but heavy. "Then let them. Change only happens when silence breaks." The man nodded slowly, visibly moved. "I've flown hundreds of times, but I've never seen someone hold their ground like that. You didn't raise your voice once, and still you shook an airline." Jonathan offered a faint nod, his thoughts still distant. Inside, his mind warred with itself. He had spoken with composure, delivered ultimatums with precision, but the memory of those first moments lingered. The sting of being dismissed, of having his name doubted, his seat denied, his dignity questioned, it still burned. No number of viewers, no CEO's concession, no applause could erase the humiliation he had felt standing in that aisle. He leaned back, staring out the window. The reflection of his face in the glass seemed almost foreign, the calm mask of a man who carried weight others could not see. He wondered, briefly, what it would take for the world to stop questioning who belonged and who didn't. From the front, Captain Raymond Cole's voice filled the cabin again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for your patience. We are now at cruising altitude. Service will begin shortly, but no one reached for menus or magazines." The captain's words fell like routine against the backdrop of a flight that had already defied routine in every way. Maya lowered her phone for the first time, her hand trembling from the adrenaline of holding it steady for so long. She glanced at Jonathan, then leaned forward. "Mr. Miles, may I ask you something?" Jonathan turned his gaze toward her, his expression softening slightly. "Go ahead." Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "How do you stay so calm? Most people would have exploded. You didn't. You carried yourself like you knew this moment would come." Jonathan studied her for a moment, then answered in a voice low and even, "Because I've lived this moment many times. The clothes change, the setting changes, but the story is the same. People see what they expect to see, not who you are. If I let anger write my words, the world would only hear noise. But if I hold steady, they hear the truth." Maya's throat tightened. She whispered, "That's powerful." Her phone buzzed. She glanced down. Her stream had crossed 90,000 viewers. She whispered into the mic, her eyes glistening. "You heard him. That's why this matters." Applause broke again from a cluster of passengers in row 4, as though Jonathan's words had struck something deep within them. Others nodded silently, their eyes locked on him, their faces carrying respect tinged with shame for having once doubted. Jonathan exhaled slowly, turning back to the window. His phone buzzed again, this time flashing a name across the screen, Evelyn Carter. He answered quietly, putting the phone to his ear rather than speaker this time. "Jonathan," Evelyn's voice came through, taut with urgency. "It's everywhere already. CNN, BBC, online feeds they're replaying Maya's live stream. You need to be prepared for the storm when you land." Jonathan's eyes narrowed, though his tone remained calm. "Let it come. I didn't start this storm, but I won't hide from it." Evelyn paused, her voice softening. "You're not alone. We'll handle this together." Jonathan ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He closed his eyes briefly, inhaling the steady rhythm of the engines. Inside, a quiet battle raged between exhaustion and resolve, between the scars of humiliation and the strength of victory. Carla shifted slightly in her seat, her voice breaking the silence. I didn't mean. She trailed off, unable to finish. Jonathan opened his eyes, studying her for a long moment. His face betrayed no cruelty, only the measured calm of someone who had already passed judgment. Meaning doesn't erase consequence. Remember that. Carla lowered her head again, shame burning across her cheeks. The cabin dimmed as the crew lowered the lights for the evening portion of the flight. Shadows softened the faces of passengers, but the glow of their screens lit the air with an unshakable reminder the world outside was watching, and the story had only just begun. Jonathan folded his arms, leaning back in 2A around him. Whispers spread. Phones flashed. Hearts fluttered across live streams. The man once doubted for his hoodie now sat as the unshakable center of gravity in a cabin transformed by truth. At 30,000 feet, the ripples of his stand stretched outward. By the time the plane touched down, those ripples would crash as waves against the world beyond the clouds. The cabin had grown quieter, but it was not the silence of calm. It was the silence of watching, of waiting, of countless minds processing the storm that had unfolded only minutes earlier. Outside, the night sky stretched dark and endless. Inside, the glow of phones lit up faces, each screen a window to the tidal wave of reaction already sweeping across the world. Jonathan Miles sat in 2A, his seat now feeling less like a luxury and more like a witness stand. His phone buzzed again and again, but he let it rest untouched. He could already sense what the headlines were saying. He didn't need to read them to feel the weight of millions of eyes fixed on him. Across the aisle, Maya Thompson leaned over her phone, her whisper still feeding into her live stream. Her viewer count had passed 100,000 now, the comments so fast they blurred into streaks of color. "It's gone global," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm seeing translations in Spanish, French, even Korean. People all over the world are watching this flight." Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering as notifications flooded their own devices. Some read aloud the headlines, "Airline faces fire. After CEO humiliated mid-flight. Viral video of first-class confrontation sparks. Outrage. Respect on trial at 30,000 feet." Jonathan kept his gaze on the window, watching the faint reflection of his own face against the black glass. His calm exterior hid the storm of emotions inside. Humiliation still stung like a fresh bruise. Victory, though undeniable, carried with it the ache of battles fought too many times. He thought of his company, his employees, his family. How many of them would wake tomorrow to see his name trending, his dignity put on trial for the world's entertainment? A voice cut through the quiet. It was a passenger from row 3, a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair and eyes sharp with anger. She turned to Carla, her tone firm but controlled. "You owe him more than an apology. You owe every one of us an apology. We saw what you did. We heard your words." Carla flinched, her lips parting as though to speak, but no sound came out. Another passenger chimed in, a young man from row 5, his voice carrying across the cabin. "You made us all complicit in it. We had to sit here and watch you tear him down, knowing it was wrong. That's on you." Murmurs of agreement spread, some passengers nodding, others snapping quiet affirmations. Carla shrank into her seat, her hands trembling in her lap. Jonathan finally turned his gaze from the window, studying her. His voice was calm, even quiet. but it carried across the space with clarity. Carla, the world will judge you. They already are. But the harsher judgment will be your own. Every time you close your eyes, you'll hear your words echo. Remember this feeling. Let it teach you. Carla's chin quivered. She bowed her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. For the first time, there was no defiance left in her, only the hollow weight of shame. Maya whispered to her phone. You all heard that. He didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He just told her the truth. And she knows it. The counter ticked higher. 120,000. Hearts and fire emojis poured across the feed. Jonathan leaned back again, closing his eyes briefly. He wasn't interested in Carla's ruin. He wasn't interested in her tears. What mattered was what came after, whether the airline would follow through, whether this moment would turn from spectacle to change. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call. He answered quietly, holding it to his ear. It was Evelyn Carter again. Jonathan. Her voice came fast, urgent. We're moving already. Legal is drafting the new training protocols. Comms is preparing the press conference for tomorrow morning. Patricia herself is leading it. They don't want to waste a second. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Good. Make sure it's not just words. Evelyn's voice softened. It won't be. You forced their hand. They can't afford to fake it now. The whole world is watching. He ended the call, slipping the phone away. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe. Change was moving, faster than he had dared hope. But still, he knew too well how institutions worked. Promises were easy. Action was harder. A soft voice drew his attention. It was the businessman in 1C again, his phone glowing faintly in his hand. Mr. Miles, he said, my wife just texted me. She's watching from home. She said, she's proud of you. And she doesn't even know you. Jonathan's chest tightened slightly. He offered a small nod. Thank her for me. Tell her I'll try to make sure this wasn't in vain. The man smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. From the back of first class, another passenger spoke. This one younger, perhaps in his 20s. Mr. Miles, can I just say, I've been through something like this. Not here, not on a plane, but I know what it feels like to be treated like you don't belong. Watching you stand your ground, it meant more than you know. Jonathan's throat tightened, though his face remained composed. He nodded once, his voice low. Then I didn't stand for myself alone. The cabin was quiet again, but it was no longer tense. It was reverent, heavy with the understanding that they had all witnessed something larger than one confrontation. Jonathan turned again to the window. The clouds below stretched endless, the horizon glowing faintly with the curve of the earth. His reflection looked back at him, not triumphant, not broken, but steady. He thought of the demands he had made, the promises Patricia Hayes had given. He thought of the passengers who would leave this plane, not with stories of luxury or delays, but with a memory that would live in headlines, in hashtags, in conversations across dinner tables. And beneath it all, he thought of the truth he had spoken to Carla. Respect is not a privilege, it is a right. The engines droned steadily, carrying them closer to their destination. But for Jonathan, the destination was no longer just an airport. It was the beginning of a reckoning, one that would stretch beyond the skies and into boardrooms, newsrooms, and living rooms across the world. At 30,000 feet, judgment had already been delivered. But what mattered now was whether the airline and the world would carry the lesson forward once they touched down. The hours that followed passed in an uneasy quiet. The cabin lights dimmed. Flight attendants moved about silently, and passengers whispered in low tones, still carrying the weight of what they had witnessed. Jonathan Miles remained still in 2A, his hands folded lightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the darkness outside. The engines droned, steady as a heartbeat, but inside him, thoughts churned without pause. He replayed the confrontation again and again, the dismissive laugh, the demand for receipts, the refusal to believe his name. Each moment lingered like an echo in his chest. Even now, with the airline CEO conceding to his demands, the sting of being doubted clung stubbornly to him. He thought of his father, who had once told him, "When they don't see you for who you are, stand tall until they have no choice." Tonight, he had stood tall, but he knew too well that tomorrow, someone else would face the same doubt, the same dismissal. He wanted tonight to mean it would happen less often. The intercom crackled. Captain Raymond Cole's voice carried across the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please fasten your seatbelts. Local time is 6:47 MUL." Passengers stirred, phones buzzing with notifications as signals reconnected. Headlines, clips, and hashtags flooded their screens, painting the reality of the storm awaiting them below. Maya Thompson's voice whispered into her phone. Though her stream now carried more than 150,000 viewers, "We're about to land. Media outlets are already waiting at the gate. This isn't just a story anymore. It's a movement." Jonathan exhaled slowly, his hand brushing against the phone in his pocket. He could feel the world pressing in, ready to demand more of him, ready to make him a symbol whether he wanted it or not. The landing was smooth, the wheels kissing the runway with barely a jolt. But inside, hearts raced, adrenaline surging as passengers realized what awaited them outside. When the plane rolled to a stop at the gate, the seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers unbuckled quickly, yet none rushed for the exit. All eyes turned to the front, to Jonathan in 2A, to the man who had carried himself with quiet steel and forced an airline to its knees. The cabin doors opened. A wave of flashing lights immediately burst through. Cameras and microphones clustered just beyond the jet bridge. Voices shouted over one another. "Mr. Miles! Mr. Miles! Do you have a statement? How do you feel after what happened on this flight? What do you want the world to know?" Jonathan rose slowly, his posture composed, his face calm. He turned once toward the passengers, meeting their eyes one by one. Some clapped softly, others gave nods of respect. Maya lowered her phone, tears brimming in her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you." Jonathan inclined his head, then stepped forward. The jet bridge was a gauntlet of cameras. Reporters leaned forward, thrusting microphones toward him. Security guards held the crowd back, their faces tense. Beyond the lights, he could see Thomas Grant, the station manager, pale and sweating, and Patricia Hayes, the CEO, flanked by executives. Patricia stepped forward, her face drawn tight with exhaustion, but firm with resolve. She raised her voice above the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, let me be clear. What happened on this flight was unacceptable. Mr. Miles was wronged, and we will make this right, not with words, but with action." The crowd erupted and shouted questions. Patricia lifted her hands, silencing them. "Every frontline employee will undergo mandatory retraining. We will implement new protocols to ensure dignity and fairness are upheld in every interaction. And tomorrow morning, I will deliver a public apology on national television." This airline failed, and we will not hide from that truth. Reporters scribbled, cameras flashed, passengers gasped. Patricia turned, her gaze settling on Jonathan. "Mr. Miles, I want to thank you for standing firm. You exposed what we must fix." Jonathan held her gaze, his face calm. He spoke, his voice carrying over the noise, deliberate and steady. "This was never just about me. It was about every person who has been told they don't belong. Every person humiliated for nothing more than their appearance. Respect is not a privilege. It is a right. And if tonight has taught us anything, it's that silence only protects the problem. Truth, even when uncomfortable, is the only way forward." The crowd roared with questions again, but his words cut through like steel. Passengers behind him clapped, some raising their phones to record the moment. Maya, still streaming, whispered into her mic, "You heard him. This is bigger than one flight. This is about all of us." Carla Whitman appeared at the edge of the crowd, escorted by security. Her face was streaked with tears, her shoulders trembling. Reporters turned cameras toward her instantly, shouting her name, but she lowered her head, shielding her face. For her, the judgment had already been delivered, not by Jonathan, but by the weight of the world's gaze. David Kim followed, his expression grim, his silence louder than any excuse he could have offered. Patricia Hayes stepped forward again, raising her voice. "Effective immediately. Both crew members involved have been suspended pending termination. This company will not tolerate discrimination in any form. Not anymore." Gaffs rippled. Cameras clicked frantically. Carla let out a faint cry, stumbling as security guided her past the crowd. David walked with stiff steps, eyes hollow. Jonathan remained still, his eyes steady. He felt no triumph in their downfall, only the quiet gravity of consequence. He knew the story would not end here, but at least tonight. Accountability had spoken. A reporter shouted above the noise, "Mr. Miles 1. Last question. What do you want the world to remember from this?" Jonathan paused, then answered in a voice calm yet resonant. "That dignity should never have to be defended. But when it is, stand firm. Because one moment, one person, can force change." The crowd erupted, cameras flashing in a frenzy. Reporters shouted more questions, but Jonathan turned away, walking steadily toward the exit. He had said what needed to be said. The rest was not in words, but in actions yet to come. As he stepped out of the terminal into the cool morning air, Jonathan felt the weight on his chest lighten, not gone, never gone, but shared now with a world that had witnessed the truth. He glanced upward at the brightening sky, clouds glowing with the first light of dawn, and in that moment, he knew the flight would be remembered not for its destination, but for what had happened in the space between departure and arrival. A courtroom in the sky, a reckoning among the clouds, and the reminder that respect, once denied, must be demanded until it can no longer be withheld. Jonathan Miles walked on, calm, composed, carrying with him not just the scars of humiliation, but the unshakable resolve to ensure it would mean something. The cabin lights dimmed, but the world outside had already lit up. By the time Jonathan Miles stepped off that plane, the truth was no longer contained in first class. It had spread to millions. What began as a humiliation became a turning point. What began as prejudice ended as reform. And yet, the question lingers. How many times has this story played out silently, without cameras, without witnesses? How many people have been told, in one form or another, that they don't belong? Jonathan's calm defiance reminded us that dignity is not granted by uniforms, titles, or appearances. Dignity is a birthright, and when denied, it must be defended with patience, with resolve, and with the courage to let truth speak louder than anger. We leave this story not only with outrage toward discrimination, but with a renewed respect for the quiet strength it takes to stand against it. May it stir us to speak when silence would be easier, to act when indifference tempts us, and to demand a world where respect is no longer conditional. If this story moved you, let it move others too. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that shine a light where silence once lived. Because the fight for dignity is not over, and the next story may be closer than you think.